Here's the full rewrite. Longer, stronger, no headings. Pay close attention to what I am about to explain, because what I am about to walk you through is the single most misunderstood power structure operating in the global economy right now. And almost no one in mainstream coverage is explaining it correctly. The headlines give you trade wars, tariffs, diplomatic summits, politicians' statements carefully worded by lawyers, and read into cameras by people who understand none of the structural mechanisms underneath them. That is real, but that is the surface. The actual war being fought underneath the diplomacy is a war over who controls the materials that make modern civilization physically possible. Not oil, not money, not nuclear weapons. 17 metals with names most people cannot pronounce. And the outcome of that war determines whether your electric vehicle gets built, whether your country's military can fire a precision missile, whether the semiconductor inside your phone gets manufactured at all. Every green energy project on Earth depends on them. Every advanced weapon system, every data center running the artificial intelligence that governments and corporations are betting their entire futures on. And right now, one country controls the mechanism that turns these metals from rocks in the ground into the materials that make all of it work. By the end of this, you will understand exactly how that control was built, why it is structurally more dangerous than the Strait of Hormuz, what it has already done to global markets once, and what it means for your household, your economy, and the balance of power for the next 50 years. Most people who cover this topic give you the surface. By the end of this, you will have the architecture underneath it. Rare earth elements are not rare. That is the first thing mainstream coverage gets wrong, and it matters because the name itself creates a false impression of the problem. These 17 metals exist on every continent on Earth. The United States has significant deposits. Australia has them. India has them. Brazil has them. Greenland sits on some of the largest known reserves on the planet. Africa has enormous concentrations across multiple countries. If you drew a map of where rare earth deposits exist in the ground, you would conclude that no single country should ever be able to dominate this market. The geology does not support monopoly, and yet monopoly is exactly what exists. So the question worth asking is not where rare earths are. The question is what actually happened. And the answer to that question is one of the most consequential strategic decisions made by any government in the 20th century, executed so quietly and over such a long time horizon that the rest of the world did not notice until it was already too late to respond easily. In the late 20th century, while Western governments were focused on oil markets, nuclear deterrence, and the ideological competition of the Cold War, China identified something that nobody in Washington or Brussels or Tokyo was paying serious attention to. Rare earth processing is extraordinarily expensive. It is environmentally destructive in ways that create serious political problems for democratic governments. It is technically complex in ways that take decades to master at industrial scale. And it was, at that moment, being abandoned by the country that had built the most sophisticated rare earth industry on Earth. The United States had been the world's dominant producer of rare earths through the Mountain Pass facility in California, a mine that had supplied global markets for decades. Then the environmental costs of processing became politically unsustainable. Regulatory pressure mounted, the economics shifted. Mountain Pass effectively shut down its processing operations. American expertise in rare earth refining dispersed. The institutional knowledge that takes generations to accumulate began to evaporate. And China watched all of this happen and made a calculation that no Western government was willing to make. They would absorb the pollution. They would accept the environmental damage across their own territory. They would invest state capital across decades into infrastructure that would not pay visible returns for a generation. And in exchange, they would own the one thing the entire technological future of human civilization depends on. That decision, executed quietly and consistently across the 1980s and 1990s and into the 2000s, is now the most consequential geopolitical move of the last century. More consequential than any military alliance signed in that period. More consequential than any oil agreement negotiated during those decades. Because what China built was not just mining capacity. They built the entire supply chain, from ore in the ground to finished material ready for a manufacturer to use. And that distinction is not a technical detail. It is the entire strategic reality of the situation. Here is the mechanism that Western analysts consistently fail to explain clearly to the public, and the failure to explain it is why most people fundamentally misunderstand where the leverage actually sits. China produces approximately 60 to 70% of the world's raw rare earth supply. That number sounds overwhelming, but it actually understates the leverage by a significant margin. Because mining is only the first step in a multi-stage process, and it is not the step that creates the strategic choke point. The real choke point is processing. Taking raw ore out of the ground produces nothing a manufacturer can use directly. That ore has to be chemically separated, refined, and processed into specific compounds and alloys before it becomes the neodymium magnet inside an electric motor, or the europium compound that produces color in a display, or the dysprosium additive that allows a magnet to function at high temperatures without losing its properties. That processing step requires specialized chemical expertise that took China decades to develop. It requires purpose-built industrial infrastructure that costs billions to construct. It requires environmental management systems for the toxic byproducts that most countries are politically unwilling to build at scale. And it requires an accumulated base of institutional knowledge that currently does not exist at meaningful scale anywhere outside China. China controls approximately 85 to 90% of global rare earth processing capacity. What that means in practice is something that should make every policymaker in every Western capital deeply uncomfortable. Even when rare earths are mined in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, in Brazil, they are frequently loaded onto ships and sent to China to be processed, because there is simply nowhere else on Earth with the capacity to handle the volume at the price point that makes the economics work. You can dig ore out of the ground in Montana or Western Australia, but you still need China to turn it into something a manufacturer can actually use. This is not a mining monopoly that can be broken by opening new mines. It is a processing stranglehold that requires years of construction, billions in capital, trained workforces that do not exist, and environmental trade-offs that democratic governments struggle to accept. The timeline to close that gap in any meaningful way is not months. It is not a few years. Independent analysts and government assessments consistently point to timelines measured in decades, and every year that passes without closing, it is another year in which the dependency deepens as global demand for rare earth-dependent technologies accelerates. This is not theoretical leverage sitting unused in a diplomatic toolkit. China has already demonstrated it operationally against a major economy, and the demonstration was sufficiently alarming that it permanently changed how governments around the world think about resource security. In 2010, a Chinese fishing vessel collided with Japanese Coast Guard ships near disputed islands in the East China Sea called the Senkaku Islands by Japan and the Diaoyu Islands by China. The diplomatic dispute that followed was by historical standards relatively contained. No military assets were mobilized, no shots were fired. The incident was serious but not exceptional by the standards of territorial disputes in that region. China's response, however, was exceptional. They did not move a naval vessel. They did not issue a military threat. They restricted rare earth exports to Japan. The mechanism was bureaucratic in form and devastating in effect. Export licenses were delayed. Shipments were held. The paperwork moved slowly in ways that created immediate uncertainty in Japanese supply chains, without requiring China to formally announce an embargo that would have triggered international trade litigation. Within weeks, prices for certain rare earth elements spiked by more than 500% on global spot markets. Japanese manufacturers who depend on rare earths for consumer electronics, automotive components, precision instruments, and industrial equipment faced immediate uncertainty about whether their supply chains would hold. Factories began rationing inventory. Procurement managers placed emergency calls to suppliers who had nothing to offer. The disruption moved from diplomatic incident to factory floor consequence in a matter of days. The episode lasted several months before diplomatic pressure and the threat of formal WTO complaints caused China to ease the restrictions. But the lesson it delivered to every government on Earth was not temporary. It was permanent. Rare earths were not just a resource. They were a weapon, and China had just conducted a live fire demonstration against the world's third largest economy, using nothing more than bureaucratic delays on export paperwork. The response from other governments was immediate. Australia accelerated investment in its Lynas Corporation, today the largest rare earth producer outside China, specifically because the 2010 episode made the dependency visible and frightening to Canberra in a way that years of quiet analysis had failed to do. The United States began reassessing Mountain Pass. Japan struck bilateral agreements with Australia, Canada, and other producers to diversify its supply base. The entire architecture of government thinking about rare earth security changed in the months after China demonstrated what the weapon could do at partial deployment. Now understand what has changed since 2010. Global demand for rare earths has not held steady. It has accelerated dramatically as the energy transition, the artificial intelligence build-out, and advanced military modernization programs have all converged on the same 17 metals simultaneously. A single F-35 fighter jet contains over 900 pounds of rare earth materials distributed across its airframe, avionics, radar systems, and propulsion. Each Patriot missile battery depends on rare earth components that have no substitute. Every fifth-generation radar system, every guided munition designed for precision engagement. The United States military's entire modernization program runs through rare earth processing capacity that China controls. The 2010 demonstration was conducted at low power against a civilian economy during a peacetime territorial dispute. The full weapon pointed at military supply chains during an actual conflict has never been fired, and that is the number that should focus every defense planner's attention. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day. When it closes, or when transit conditions become unpredictable, the world feels it within weeks through energy price movements that transmit into every corner of the global economy. It is the most visible and most discussed choke point in geopolitical analysis, precisely because the transmission mechanism is fast, observable, and hits household budgets in ways that voters notice immediately. But oil has a structural characteristic that rare earths do not possess, and that characteristic is what makes the comparison between Hormuz and rare earth processing so important to understand correctly. Oil can be rerouted. Saudi Arabia maintains pipeline capacity that can move a portion of its exports to the Red Sea without transiting the strait. Strategic petroleum reserves held by the United States, Japan, and IEA member states were specifically designed and sized to buffer a Hormuz disruption for months while alternative supply arrangements are made. Producers in the United States, Canada, Norway, and elsewhere can increase output in response to a supply shock even if the response takes months to fully materialize. The system has redundancy engineered into it through decades of policy work specifically because governments recognized the vulnerability and invested in managing it. Rare earth processing has none of that redundancy. There is no strategic rare earth processing reserve. There is no alternative refining network sitting at partial capacity waiting to be activated in an emergency. There is no allied coalition of processing facilities that could collectively absorb Chinese export restrictions and keep global supply chains functioning. When China restricted exports to Japan in 2010, Tokyo could not call Washington or Canberra and ask them to activate emergency processing capacity. That capacity did not exist. It still does not exist at the scale needed to matter. The Mountain Pass mine in California, America's primary domestic rare earth mining operation, still routes a significant portion of its output to China for processing, because the domestic refining infrastructure has not been rebuilt to the scale needed to handle the full volume. The United States is extracting ore from American soil and shipping it to its primary strategic competitor to be turned into usable material. That is the current operational reality of American rare earth supply chain independence. Not a future risk, not a hypothetical vulnerability, the current situation as it actually exists. The disruption does not arrive at your household as a dramatic news event with a clear timestamp you can point to afterward. It arrives as a price signal that moves through an invisible transmission chain and lands on your kitchen table looking like inflation, like a product that costs more than it should, like a technology that is delayed or unavailable in ways that nobody in the news cycle connects back to the processing facility in Jiangxi province where the chain actually broke. Step 1 is electric vehicle production. The permanent magnets inside electric motors depend on neodymium and dysprosium processed to specific purity levels. There is no substitute material that currently performs at equivalent efficiency at commercial scale. A sustained rare earth supply disruption does not make electric vehicles more expensive in the way that a steel tariff makes them more expensive. It makes them impossible to manufacture at current volumes because the fundamental component of the drivetrain cannot be sourced. Ford, GM, Toyota, Volkswagen. Every major automaker that has committed tens of billions in capital to electric vehicle production lines holds rare earth magnet inventory measured in weeks, not months. A 90-day disruption does not inconvenience the electric vehicle industry. It shuts production lines. Step 2 is renewable energy infrastructure. Wind turbines use the same permanent magnet technology as electric motors. A 2-megawatt wind turbine requires approximately 800 pounds of rare earth magnets to function at the efficiency levels that make the economics of wind energy work. Europe's renewable energy build-out, the energy sovereignty strategy that governments across the continent adopted after the Russia-Ukraine war made fossil fuel dependency politically and economically unsustainable, depends on a continuous flow of processed rare earth materials through Chinese refineries. The green energy transition and the Chinese rare earth processing monopoly are not separate policy questions that can be managed independently. They are the same question. Step 3 is defense production. The United States Department of Defense has formally designated rare earth supply as a critical national security vulnerability in multiple official documents. Every precision-guided munition depends on rare earth components. Every advanced radar system, every electronic warfare platform, every fifth-generation aircraft. In a conflict scenario that directly involves China, the rare earth supply does not get gradually restricted through the kind of bureaucratic delays China used against Japan in 2010. It gets cut, and American defense production faces a materials crisis at exactly the moment strategic circumstances require it to accelerate. Your household absorbs all three of these disruptions not as rare earth news, but as the electric vehicle that costs far more than projected. The energy bill that stays higher longer than economists predicted. The defense supplemental appropriation that Congress passes and that gets paid for through the inflation that lands in your grocery cart 6 months later. China's economy is too deeply embedded in global trade for a complete rare earth embargo to be a cost-free option for Beijing. A full embargo against the United States and its allies would do something China genuinely wants to prevent. It would create the political conditions in Western democracies for the kind of emergency investment in alternative processing capacity that Beijing has spent years trying to make economically unviable through its own pricing strategies. The 2010 Japan episode, intended as a demonstration of leverage, inadvertently created the political will in Australia and Japan to fund Linus Corporation into existence as a serious alternative. A full embargo today would produce a Manhattan Project-scale response in rare earth processing investment across the United States, Europe, Australia, Japan, and South Korea simultaneously. That response would take years to mature, but it would eventually close the gap in ways that partial pressure never will. So the weapon operates at maximum strategic effectiveness, not when it is fired at full power, but when it is held at partial deployment. Enough restriction to create uncertainty. Enough control to remind every government exactly where the dependency sits. Enough leverage to influence negotiations without triggering the emergency response that would ultimately undermine the leverage itself. This is precisely the calculation China executed in 2023 and 2024 when it imposed export controls on gallium and germanium, two materials critical to semiconductor manufacturing. Not a complete embargo, not a dramatic announcement. Just export licensing requirements that created uncertainty, raised costs, and sent an unambiguous message to every technology company and defense ministry on Earth about where the real leverage in the technology competition sits. The message required no military exercise to deliver. It required a licensing form and a bureaucratic delay. And every government that received that message understood it completely. You do not need classified intelligence access to monitor how this develops in real time. You need the right three signals and the framework to interpret what they are actually measuring. The first signal is ASML export license approvals, published by the Dutch government. ASML manufactures the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that produce the world's most advanced semiconductors, and they are the single most critical choke point in the chip supply chain outside of rare earth processing itself. The two choke points feed the same technology dependency. When Dutch government policy on ASML licenses tightens in response to geopolitical pressure, it signals that the broader technology competition is intensifying and rare earth pressure typically follows the same trajectory. Watch the license approval rate, not the diplomatic statements. The second signal is MP Materials' quarterly earnings reports and production disclosures. MP Materials operates Mountain Pass and represents America's most serious current attempt to rebuild domestic rare earth capability. Their quarterly disclosures tell you the honest operational reality of how fast or how slowly American supply chain independence is actually being built, as opposed to announced. When their processing capacity numbers stall, or when their ore continues routing to China for refining, that gap between political announcement and industrial reality is the most important data point in American rare earth policy. The third signal is United States Department of Defense rare earth stockpile procurement announcements buried in defense budget supplemental requests and Pentagon acquisition notices. When the DoD begins building stockpiles of specific rare earth compounds above their normal inventory targets, they are operationally pricing in a supply disruption they are not announcing in press conferences. Defense procurement behavior tells you what the government actually believes about the risk, as opposed to what it says about the risk in public statements. These three signals require no security clearance. They require only the framework to understand what they are measuring and why the numbers matter before the consequences become visible to everyone else. The war behind the trade war is not fought with tariffs. It is not fought with naval vessels or precision missiles or diplomatic communiques. It is fought with export licenses and processing capacity and the accumulated industrial expertise of a 4-decade strategic investment that the rest of the world is only now beginning to understand fully. China did not seize a choke point. They built one. Quietly, patiently, over a longer time horizon than most democratic governments are capable of planning across. And the choke point they built does not sit in a waterway that can be contested by a carrier strike group. It sits inside chemical processing facilities and industrial supply chains and institutional knowledge bases that cannot be neutralized by any military option currently available. The Strait of Hormuz can theoretically be reopened by naval power. The rare earth processing monopoly cannot be broken by anything except time, capital, and the political will to absorb the environmental costs that China absorbed decades ago, while everyone else was looking somewhere else. That is the structural reality underneath every conversation about trade wars, technology competition, and the future balance of power between the United States and China. And it belongs to you now.